Welcome to this video on the history of vampires from the tabletop role-playing game Vampire: The Masquerade. And this project has been kind of cursed because I lost my first set of notes for this thing, and then I lost a second set of notes, so having to redo work is always fun. In addition to that small problem, there are two other issues I have to address up front. First, volume. Simply put, there's quite a bit of lore concerning vampires in VTM. For the sake of keeping things somewhat smooth, I will be sticking to major events and happenings. This will not be a 9-part Ken Burns-style documentary, much as I love the Civil War. Second issue relates to the first, consistency. The volume of lore, editorial errors, retcons, and in-character narratives has resulted in some inconsistencies or flat-out contradictions. And I am going to avoid as many of them as possible because, again, no 9-part documentaries. Good news though, at least for some people. After note-taking and revising, there is simply no way for me to fit all of this information into a single video. So, you'll be getting a two-piece. This video will run from Cain to approximately the formation of the two major vampire sects, the Camarilla and the Sabbat. Video number 2 will pick up from there up until the events of November 1st, 2004. With all that in mind, but without further ado, the history of vampires. So everything in Vampire: The Masquerade begins with Cain, the third mortal, depending on who you ask, and the first man born of woman, after Adam and Eve were cast out of Eden. Since I assailed you with rusty Vulgate Latin in the last video, I'll spare you further Bible references and stick with the Book of Nod's version of events. Cain and his younger brother, possibly twin, Abel, each followed their own way in the world. Cain was a farmer, or agrarian, and Abel was a shepherd. Adam instructed them to make sacrifices to God, which they did, Cain with his fruits and grains, Abel with his best lambs. Abel's sacrifice was favored, and so he was blessed, which irritated Cain to no good end. Well, that end was Abel's murder at Cain's hands, the true motive of which was never revealed. The Book of Nod gives Cain's motive as a twisted version of human sacrifice crossed with brotherly love. Bad move considering that human sacrifice is one of those big no-nos. Cain's crime was discovered, not by God, but by Adam, his father, who cursed his eldest son and banished him to the land of Nod. But how could Adam curse his son and have it stick? Keep in mind that Adam, in the Bible, was the official namer of the creatures of the earth, which could be interpreted as having some form of power over the true names of things. In Mummy, the power of nomenclature is pretty significant, up to and including erasing people from existence. Or, if you want to go with Demon the Fallen, Adam did get some of the secrets of creation from the lips of Lucifer himself, so there's that possible source of this curse. Whatever the case may be, Cain could no longer work the land, he could no longer bring forth life from the earth, and he wandered the world as a cursed being. In his wandering, he met Lilith, Adam's first wife, mother of demons, queen of the night, and all other titles and sobriquets I might have missed. Lilith's exact nature is a subject of some debate. The Book of Nod strongly implies that Lilith possessed something akin to true magic. The revelations of the Dark Mother suggest that Lilith is some form of demigod or demi-demon after vigorous sex with both God and Lucifer, though not at the same time, and then eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then creating her own version of the Garden of Eden. But I'm sticking to the Book of Nod. Lilith gave Cain some comfort in his exile. She fed him, clothed him, and sheltered him. When Cain inquired how she could do all these things, she told him that she was awakened. Cain then asked for her to awaken him as well. But Lilith saw the curse hanging over Cain, and was uncertain of what the attempt might do to him. It could fail, or destroy him, or even turn him into something worse. It was then that Cain told her that he would not live as her thrall, and that a life without power was not worth living. Lilith fed Cain her own blood, and he fell into a dreamlike abyss where he was confronted by 4 of God's Archangels. Michael, commander of the heavenly host and seraph of the flaming sword, asked Cain to repent and be restored to God's grace. When Cain refused, Michael cursed Cain with the vulnerability to fire. Then came Raphael, the regent of the sun, who told Cain that Abel had forgiven him, and again asked Cain to repent. And again, Cain refused. Raphael then cursed Cain so that the sun would forever be an anathema to him, and burn his flesh as thoroughly as Michael's fire. When the sun rose in this dream state, Cain dug himself into the earth to hide until nightfall. As Cain rose from the ground, Uriel, the Archangel of Death, appeared before him. The dark-winged Reaper told Cain that God had forgiven his sin, and that Uriel had come personally to give Cain the peace of death, if only he would accept. Cain rejected mercy from God, and so Uriel also cursed Cain. As he had spilled Abel's blood, blood would be all that he would ever feed upon, all that could possibly sustain him. Everything Cain's hand touched from then on would fall to death and ruin and despair. Cain wept at this final curse, but no tears filled his eyes, only blood. Gabriel, the Archangel of Revelation and the Guide of Souls, then came to Cain. The left hand of God inflicted no curses upon him, but offered Cain hope, even in his wretched condition. Gabriel told Cain that the path of God's mercy would always be open to him, the road of Golconda, so that he, and all who would come after him, would once again walk in the light of God. Cain remained with Lilith for a time as she taught him how to wield power as she did, yet she warned him against the path of blood which had appeared before Cain. But Cain rejected her wisdom and unlocked the path. Cain then fled from Lilith under cover of darkness, so far until Lilith's demons could no longer pursue him. How long Cain continued to wander is unclear. Cain again wandered the earth, so far and so long that his name and his crime eventually were forgotten. He returned to the world of mortals, the descendants of his brother born after his exile, Seth. Cain appeared in a city of men and revealed his power. The people in turn worshipped him and made him their king. Now, here I have to note that different clans have their own version of Cain's entree into the first city, but those will have to wait for another time. Cain, despite his power, felt the weight of solitude. Despite being surrounded by followers and worshippers, he was alone, for none in the world were like him. Gabriel had foretold that Cain would eventually create more like himself, but Cain had not yet discovered how to spread his curse to others, to embrace mortals into the darkness with him. The Book of Nod attributes this knowledge to demons called by Cain for that purpose. When Cain learned what he needed to do, Uriel once again appeared to him. The Archangel of Death warned Cain not to do what he intended, and that if he created progeny, only doom would result. But Cain ignored this warning when a young man, the best of all the mortals in the first city, named Enoch, asked Cain to become like him. Cain, out of loneliness, pride, and love, embraced Enoch, making him into a vampire. Cain then renamed the first city Enoch in honor of his first child. In time, Cain would embrace two others, Zillah, his wife, and Irad, general of Enoch. These three are generally considered as the second generation of vampires. And here I have to point out that, yet again, different clans have different lore regarding the second generation. The Assamites claim that there were 5 members of the second generation. The Ventru claimed that there were 6. Nevertheless, the second generation, in turn, created progeny of their own, the third generation. The third generation in turn created their own progeny until Cain finally forbade the creation of any more vampires on pain of final death. The first city then grew into an ancient empire. But the world groaned under the weight of Cain's sins and the sins of mortals until one day the rain came. Seemingly endless rain fell until the world was flooded, washing away the first city and a host of vampires, and nearly all of humanity, except for a family of mortals on a strange, massive wooden boat. The deluge drove Cain and his brood into torpor. When the waters receded, the descendants of Noah spread across the earth. An age passed before another vampire walked the earth, but eventually, Cain, and after him his progeny, rose from their slumber. Cain abandoned those he had created and hid himself, but his brood tracked him to a cavern deep beneath the earth. They begged Cain to return and rule over them once again, but he refused. The deluge was his punishment from God, he claimed, for having subverted the true law and returning to the world of men. He then commanded them to go, to not seek him again. So the vampires returned to the children of Noah. Without Cain to guide them, or more importantly, control them, the vampires created broods of their own without restraint, and eventually descended into war against one another. By the time it was over, the second generation had been thoroughly destroyed by its own progeny. The victors in this first battle of the War of Ages gathered, 13 in all, to raise a new city to reclaim the glory of lost Enoch. These 13 members of the third generation, these antediluvians, correspond to what we might recognize as the 13 clans: Ventru, Gangrel, Malkavian, Nosferatu, Ravnos, Toreador, La Sombra, Tzimisce, Setite, Cappadocian, Salubri, Assamite, and Bruja. Each created their own brood of fourth-generation vampires, and like Cain, they forbade their progeny from creating broods of their own, on pain of final death. The antediluvians generally had no concern for mortals, but wished to each have their own pawns while not falling to the same fate they had inflicted upon their sires. The second city, in time, grew as mighty as Enoch had, yet Cain was watching, particularly as the antediluvians destroyed his beloved childer. As God had cursed Cain, so did Cain curse the antediluvians, each with a curse that would pass on to their own children, and those children to theirs, and so on throughout the ages. And here I have to interject once more. Different clans have, again, different interpretations of the second city. Some clans, such as Ravnos, Setite, and Tzimisce, each claim to have taken no part in the second city. The Assamites are divided as to the nature of their involvement in the second city. Despite the majesty of the second city, and despite being worshipped as gods, the antediluvians feared each other, feared their own progeny, and most of all, feared that Cain would return to them and pass judgment over them for their depredations and failures. The second city was eventually racked by intrigue, then by outright war as once again, vampire fought vampire, childer turned upon sires, and mortals rose up to slay them all. The second city was destroyed, and its inhabitants fled its ruins. The antediluvians disappeared from the city, not to be seen again for many centuries. Their childer, the fourth generation, dispersed across the earth, some freed from the rule of their sires, to kill and embrace as they wished. These Methuselahs and their broods nested in villages, cities, and wild places, far from one another. They set the mortals they hid among to war against one another on their behalf. The fall of the second city, the diaspora of the fourth and fifth generations, were the birth pains of the secret war of all vampires against all others, known as the Jihad. The diaspora of vampires stretched throughout the ancient world. The Indus Valley, the Nile Valley, Mesopotamia, and every corner of the Mediterranean, all were host to one or more refugees from the second city. Some lurked in even darker corners of the earth, and would not be heard from again for centuries, if ever. Some vampires heavily influenced the cultures and customs of their host civilizations, such as the Ravnos of the Indian subcontinent, the followers of Set in Egypt, and the Tzimisce in Eastern Europe. The Assamites ascended to their hidden fortress of Alamut to train, study, and launch their secret war against the children of Cain. The Gangrel wandered throughout the world, shunning civilization and the company of clan and kind. The La Sombra lurked on the seas, rivers, and shadows of mortal society. The Cappadocians retreated to crypts and underground cities to study the mysteries of death. The Salubri wandered the world, healing and protecting the weak in equal measure. But the largest concentration of vampires in the ancient world was in Greece, and it is here that the influence of vampires on mortals and vice versa was in greatest evidence. The Toreador held court in Mycenae, the Bruja found a home in ancient Athens, and Sparta would be the Ventru's first attempt at building a society through influence rather than direct rule. It was in ancient Greece that vampires sharpened their practice of proxy war through mortal agents, pitting city-states and nations against each other to bloody their ancient rivals. The earliest recognizable form of this jihad can be traced back to the power struggles of the Hellenic world, as the vampires shaped and were shaped by the nations they aligned with. Then the ancient Mediterranean was brought under the rule of Alexander the Great, leading to a golden age for Hellenism. Meanwhile, in faraway Italy, a new power was rising to prominence: Rome. Rome, from its inception, was under the control of Clan Ventru. Rome was an interesting period in the history of vampires. The second ruler of Rome, Colat, a grandchild of the Ventru antediluvian, was not alive for the second city, yet he would make Rome into a city where vampires of different clans could coexist for the first time since then. Colat took the Roman Senate as his model and created the Eternal Senate of Cainites, with a single seat for each of the 13 clans. Of course, while the Senate held influence, power ultimately remained with Colat, and while the senators spent most of their strength struggling over boons and prestation and schemes, he ruled, with their sage advice of course, and when he chose to heed them. But the Roman Ventru were challenged for dominance over the Mediterranean, this time by the Bruja of Carthage. Carthage was the Bruja's great city, their Eden, where man and vampire lived together in open harmony. Even the Bruja's antediluvian, Trolli, took up residence there. At least, that's their version of it. There are darker stories concerning Carthage, tales of demon worship and child sacrifices to a being referred to alternately as Baal-Haman and Moloch, who was suspected to be a vampire of the secretive Cainite lineage called the Baali. Carthage's influence was spread throughout North Africa and into Iberia around the colonies of Gadir and later Carthago Nova. The Bruja were both aided and opposed in Iberia by feuding factions of Clan La Sombra. The inevitable collision between Rome and Carthage came during the reign of Colat's child, Camilla, with significant prodding from his Ventru and Malkavian advisors. The First Punic War was a purely mortal affair, with victory being secured by the dominance of Roman legions on land and the creative use of the Corvus to overcome Carthage's might at sea. This victory emboldened the Ventru, who desired territory of their own away from Camilla, and traveled to Iberia to colonize that territory, despite the presence of the Bruja and La Sombra. The Second Punic War saw the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca terrorize the Italian peninsula with war elephants, fortified with the blood of vampire auxiliaries, who followed his army over the Alps. Hannibal spent 16 years ravaging Italy and trying to starve the Romans into submission, but Rome received a continuous supply of grain and troops from his provinces, Camilla's loyal retainers. When Hannibal's supply lines were finally cut, he was forced to withdraw and was subjected finally to his first and only defeat in the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. Carthage was stripped of its richest colonies and forced to pay Rome a sizable war indemnity. In 149 BC, after significant prodding of the Senate by the legendary orator Cato the Elder and of Prince Camilla by his advisor, the Spartan Ventru Lysander, Rome declared a Third Punic War. The official pretext of the war was a dispute between Carthage and Rome's client state, Numidia. The siege of Carthage lasted for 3 years. The key to breaking the siege came from the toreador named Helena, late of the city of Troy. Yes, that Troy. Trojan War Troy. In exchange for safe passage out of Carthage for herself and her ghoul lover, she exposed every vulnerability in the defenses of the city. The battle of vampires inside of Carthage was the most brutal since the fall of the Second City. Trolli and Moloch fought back-to-back in the streets of the burning city before sinking into the earth, entwined in one another's arms. 50,000 Carthaginians who had survived the starvation and slaughter were marched off into slavery after their city had burned for 17 days and nights. The victorious coalition of Roman vampires enacted a great ritual over the ruins of Carthage to ensure that Trolli, Moloch, and any other vampires slumbering beneath the cursed ground would never rise again. As with Athens, the surviving Carthaginian Bruja scattered, most to Spain and the rest to other parts of the world. Some, like Menelaus, swore bloody vengeance against those who had destroyed the Bruja's ideal city, and particularly those who had betrayed it from within. For nearly 2 centuries, Camilla, from his seat in Rome, reigned as the near undisputed master of the ancient world's vampires. Yet his policy of permitting them into Rome caused the empire to slip through the Ventru's fingers. On July 18, 64 AD, a great fire consumed the city of Rome. Camarilla disappeared in the aftermath of the fire, believed to have met final death. In truth, he sank into torpor from despondence at the loss of his companion, Tanit Bal Sahar. Without Camilla's guidance, the Eternal Senate became more obscure and insular. 5 years later, several Roman La Sombra abandoned the Eternal City for the Roman provinces to establish their own domains. Also in the 1st century, a denizen of Rome, a Toreador Methuselah named Bestor the Wanderer, converted to Christianity in North Africa and was baptized under the new name, Michael. Near the end of the 1st century, after the disappearance of Camilla, an alliance of Toreador and Malkavians wrested control of Rome and the empire from the Ventru. While many Ventru remained in Rome, some fled north into the wild territories of Germania and inserted themselves into the tribes that dwelt along the Rhine. The newly minted Toreador-Malkavian alliance spurred the Emperor Trajan to cross the Danube and attack the Dacians, which brought Rome into conflict with the southernmost branches of Clan Tzimisce. Rome's slow decline was only interrupted by the ascent of the Emperor Constantine, who defeated his rival for the throne, Licinius, outside of the city of Byzantium in 324 AD. Supporting the new and ostensibly Christian emperor was the Toreador Michael and his two lovers, the Ventru Methuselah Antonius and the Tzimisce Methuselah, the Draken. This triumvirate of powerful vampires abandoned the city of Rome as Constantine moved the capital of the empire to the site of his greatest victory, Byzantium, later renamed after his death, Constantinople. Rome continued its descent. In 400 AD, a gangrel Methuselah named Matasuntha called a great gathering. After defeating all of her challengers, she declared war against the Ventru of Rome and led a horde in battle against the Roman provinces. The 3-year-long rampage only ended when Matasuntha disappeared after a fight with an unknown vampire. 7 years later, in 410 AD, Alaric, king of the Visigoths and one-time ally of Rome, sacked the city under guidance from the Germanic Ventru and Clan Tzimisce. Rome would limp along for 60 more years, until 476, when the German Udacir led a coalition of foederati, or foreign mercenaries, to overthrow the 16-year-old Emperor of the West, Romulus Augustus. Udacir declared himself King of Italy, marking the end of the Western Roman Empire. A year later, in response, Michael, Antonius, and the Draken held a great council and established the Trinity family system in Constantinople. Entrants to the city would have to petition and receive the sponsorship of one of their families to dwell within the city as scions. Those who did not would be expelled. The La Sombra Magnus, who betrayed his sire, Ectorius, to Michael, and the Bruja Lexer, who brought with them the entire code of Roman law, were granted scion status. Meanwhile, Alexander, a Greek Ventru, traveled to the town of Parisius in Gaul, later to be known as Paris, and established himself there as prince. Between 527 and 555 AD, the Emperor Justinian expanded the Byzantine Empire into North Africa and Italy. The Trinity system of rule spread with Justinian's armies. Shifting focus from the Eastern Empire to the Middle East, the 7th century saw the rise to prominence of a new religion in Arabia, Islam. And the converts to Islam were not exclusively mortal. In 622 AD, during Muhammad's exile in Yathrib, the La Sombra Suleiman ibn Abdullah conversed with the Meccan prophet. Suleiman then became the first vampire to convert to Islam and founded the vampire sect, the Ashira, to protect the Islamic holy places. Following Muhammad's death in 632, the Umayyad Caliphate exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula to spread Islam by any means. The various wars of the Umayyad Caliphate brought the Ashira into conflict with the Ravnos in India, the followers of Set in Egypt and the La Sombra in Spain, which was a curious situation as many of the Ashira were also La Sombra themselves. The Ashira drove several vampires of Spain into southern France, increasing the population there and spreading conflict between the Toreador rulers and the newcomers. In 674, the Muslims laid siege to the city of Constantinople, but were driven back in 678. However, the greater struggle was inside of the walls of Constantinople itself. Antonius and the Draken had quarreled for decades by this point, partially encouraged by Michael for his affection over the rulership of the city and the power of the monasteries and blood cults under the Draken's control. In order to mend the rift between the two, Michael presented the brothers Simeon and Jesu to the Draken and Antonius for them to embrace, effectively adopted sons that embodied qualities precious to both. At the beginning of the 8th century, the Draken received a message from his sire, the Tzimisce Antediluvian, a warning not to embrace Jesu, as the ancient foresaw that the boy would bring disaster on the Draken, who was still the Antediluvian's most beloved child. But the Draken ignored his sire's warning and embraced the young man, who immediately fell into torpor. The Draken believed that Jesu's misfortune was the work of one of his kin, and left the city to confront the Tzimisce he identified as the guilty party. 2 years later, while the Draken was still away, Jesu awoke from torpor and embraced his brother Simeon, who had been meant for Antonius. Enraged by what he believed was the Draken's scheme, Antonius used his influence to make Leo III emperor. At Antonius's direction, Leo III began an iconoclasm against the monasteries and cults controlled by the Draken. Meanwhile and elsewhere, the expansion of the Umayyads into Western Europe was halted in France by Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD. This drew the notice and perhaps grudging gratitude of the vampires of France. Alexander of Paris would later become the patron of Martel's grandson, the Frankish king Charlemagne, founder of the Holy Roman Empire and the Carolingian dynasty. The subsequent Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne and his son Louis the Pious gained Alexander the support of the Toreador, who would form his grand court. Near the end of the 8th century, the first known Viking raiders landed at the Abbey of Lindisfarne off the coast of England, carrying with it members of the Einherjar, ghouls and vampires in service to the gangrel Methuselah known as Odin, the All-High. Also near the turn of the century, the feud between Antonius, Michael, and the Draken became so bitter and resentful that Michael and the Draken agreed to a plan proposed by Antonius's own childer, Caius and Septima Dominica, to assassinate their sire and replace him as head of the Antonian Ventru, an action that all involved would come to regret deeply after the fact. In 842 AD, in order to bring stability back to the Byzantine Empire, Michael assumed the direct rule of Constantinople as the Emperor Michael III. He ruled for 25 years until he faked his assassination in 867 AD at the hands of Basil I, who succeeded him as emperor. In 888, the Draken, consumed by guilt and regret for the death of Antonius, left Michael and the city of Constantinople forever. 2 years later, in 890, a council was convened that formally recognized Jesu and Simeon as the new leaders of the Obertus Tzimisce in Constantinople. Michael also gave over control of his own family to his child Petronius and his longtime ally, the La Sombra Magnus, while he himself retreated to his lair beneath the Hagia Sophia, into a world of beauty, delusion, and ultimately, madness. Vampire history largely goes quiet for a few decades at this point, until 980 AD, when a group of mages belonging to the Order of Hermes performed a rite in central Transylvania to consecrate the prime chantry of their house. This chantry would become known as Charis, the core of House Tremere. But Transylvania was long a part of the traditional domains of the insular and viciously territorial vampires of Clan Tzimisce, who subjected the Tremere's chantries in the region and villages to occasional raids as punishment for the mages' disrespect. Nearly 2 decades later, Etrius, a high-ranking member of House Tremere, proved that the vis of Charis, the magical energy, and of all the Tremere chantries, was in decline, and with it, the power that fueled their longevity. Tremere himself commanded his other apprentice, Goratrix, to begin working on a solution to the problem. While the Tremere were in their race against time to preserve their magically extended lives, Clan Cappadocian, in its perpetual search to unlock the secrets of death, made contact with a Venetian merchant and accomplished necromancer named Augustus Giovanni. In 1005, Giovanni was embraced into the clan with the blood of the antediluvian himself, which they intended to secure Giovanni's loyalty. A costly mistake, to be sure. Continuing in the vein of traitors and usurpers, in 1022, Goratrix summoned Tremere and his fellow counselors to Chaeris to enact a ritual that he claimed would grant them immortality, which was true, in a way. The ritual used blood stolen from an elder of Clan Tzimisce and transformed all of the participants into vampires. Whether Goratrix knew this was to be the outcome from the start remains a subject of debate into the modern nights. But 4 years later, upon discovering that the Tremere had destroyed one of his allies to secure their own stolen immortality, Count Vladimir Rustovic, voivode of voivodes, declared war between Clan Tzimisce and House Tremere. And this was not to be a trial by war so common between Tzimisce lords. The goal of the fiends was to eradicate the warlocks entirely. After 11 years of relentless attack, in 1037, Tremere blood-bonded his inner council to himself, and then revealed to them his plan for the sevenfold pyramid structure that would solidify the clan under his rule, each bound to their senior to their senior, and ultimately all to Tremere himself. He then commanded that every mage of House Tremere be secretly embraced. This marked the beginning of the transition from House Tremere to Clan Tremere. Goratrix was then left in command of the house, as Tremere took Etrius with him on a secret journey throughout Europe. And speaking of Europe, by the end of the 11th century, knights and soldiers were on the march to answer a call from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos to relieve the city from attack by the Seljuk Turks. This armed pilgrimage, the First Crusade, reached Constantinople in 1096 AD. After its initial successes at Nicaea and Dorylaeum, the Crusaders decided to continue on to Jerusalem. Accompanying the Crusaders were, naturally, vampires. Some were, ironically, motivated by genuine religious zeal, despite their nature as the damned, and others to take part in the Crusader kingdoms they anticipated would be restored once the Holy Lands were pried from the Saracens' grasp. In addition to the Ashira, the Crusaders were met by new resistance, the warriors of Clan Asamite. Despite the clan being established on the veneration or outright worship of Hakim, their founder, the clan had embraced new warriors from the ranks of devout Muslims for over 400 years. These warriors carried their religion with them into undeath, and would still defend it against those they considered to be invaders and infidels. The Caliph of the warrior caste, Jamal, rallied his brothers against the Crusaders. In 1099, the Crusaders breached the walls of Jerusalem and sacked the city, slaughtering many inside. The vampires in the city, Crusader and native alike, were consumed by a madness for bloodshed and tore each other to pieces. Only a handful survived by the end of what was later known as the Week of Blood. The source of this madness was unknown, but a few of the survivors recall one word lingering inside of their minds: Malkav. But the Christians and the Muslims were not the only ones waging war at this time. Off in Scandinavia, in Sweden in particular, great battles were taking place. The gangrel Methuselah Odin the All-High and his Einherjar were but one of many Viking groups in medieval Scandinavia, and contesting the gangrel for supremacy of the peninsula were a tribe of werewolves known as the Get of Fenris. If you know any Norse mythology, you'll be aware that Odin and Fenris-Ulfir are not particularly amicable. Odin's Einherjar and Valkyries fought the Get of Fenris in a series of conflicts known as the Fenris Wars. The nature and duration of these wars is not well known, but the chief cause was possession of Odin's great hall at Uppsala, a place of power coveted by both vampire and werewolf alike. But in the end, neither were able to have it. In 1112 AD, Christian missionaries attacked and burned down Uppsala, Presumably they killed Odin the All-High, after which the Christians constructed a church on the site of his hall. Returning to the Omen War between the Tzimisce and Tremere, by the turn of the 12th century, the fiends had destroyed every Tremere chantry in Transylvania save for Charis. But in 1121, Goratrix, the architect of the house's descent into damnation, unveiled his new weapon to counter the Tzimisce's flesh-crafted war ghouls. Chaundis, the first gargoyle, a mystical and surgical amalgamation of Gangrel, Nosferatu, and Tzimisce captives, emerged from the birthing womb after a decade of work by himself and Virstania, the mother of gargoyles. Gargoyles would later turn the tide of the war against the Tzimisce. That same year, Tremere and Etrius returned to Charis from their wandering, with the theoretical workings of a hermetic system of blood sorcery, the foundation of the Tremere's immensely powerful and flexible system, thaumaturgy. With some of the pressure of the Tzimisce lifted, the Tremere turned their attention to securing their place among the treacherous and complex society of the children of Cain. This meant that Tremere had to take his rightful place among the ranks of the most powerful, the antediluvians. After much study and searching, Tremere identified one antediluvian he believed suited his needs, the peaceful and largely unprotected Saulot of Clan Salubri. In 1133, Tremere and his inner council traveled to Saulot's resting place in Anatolia, where he diablerized the antediluvian, as his followers did likewise to Saulot's children. Tremere immediately fell into torpor and had to be carried back to Charis, as he was locked in a spiritual battle against a creature far older and more powerful than he could have ever imagined. Meanwhile, back in Constantinople, two vampires, Epirus of Clan Ventru and Trebonius of Clan Bruja, in an effort to expel Latin influence from the city, encourage a riot in 1185. The anti-Latin riot killed every vampire in the Latin Quarter, save for one, Gabriel of Genoa, who was sheltered by the Obertus Tzimisce. Narses, leader of the Latin La Sombra and Prince of Venice, was outraged and demanded satisfaction, otherwise he would cut off trade to Constantinople. The Trinity families convened a council, in which Epirus and Trebonius were both put to death for instigating the riot. But Narses was not satisfied with this. He demanded to be given absolute rule over the Latin Quarter, free from the oversight of the Trinity. The council agreed. This marked the beginning of the end for Trinity rule in Constantinople, as Narses subsequently flooded the Latin Quarter with Cainites from every corner of Europe. In 1204 AD, Constantinople was sacked by the Fourth Crusade. The Chosen of Calomena, led by the caitiff prophet Stanislav, set fire to the city and attempted to kill every vampire they could find. The Toreador patriarch Michael was slain and diablerized by the Bali, Mary the Black. This marked the beginning of the period known as the War of Princes. The War of Princes was a series of feudal conflicts between the vampire lords of Europe and the Middle East for domains, herds, and religion. The land-hungry Ventru of the Holy Roman Empire waged war against the pagan Tzimisce, Gangrel, and Malkavians of Eastern Europe. The Toreador and Ventru of England, Scotland, and France fought for domination of the courts of those countries. The Christian La Sombra and the Muslim La Sombra struggled for control of Spain in the Shadow Reconquista. The Assamites and the Ashira hurled sultanates and caliphates at the Crusader kingdoms of Outremer to expel them from the Holy Land. A major flashpoint in the War of Princes and the history of vampires as a whole would occur just 5 years after the downfall of Constantinople. This was the Albigensian Crusade against the heretical Cathars of southern France. Southern France was also home to a number of vampires who were refugees from Spain and the recently sacked Constantinople. The area itself was under the rule of fiefs that were influenced by the Toreador of the Courts of Love. But as I mentioned before, the Ventru and the Toreador were locked in a struggle for domain and power. Before 1209, Fabricio Ulfila, a Ventru and member of the ecclesiastic faction, was allies with both Mithras of London and Alexander of Paris. Ulfila decided to destabilize the Toreador by inciting the church against the Cathars, first in an attempt to convert them, then to wage war against the Cathars and their protectors. Ufila laid small bits of evidence, breadcrumbs that the intrepid crusaders would follow, straight to the doorsteps of the unsuspecting toreadors of southern France. Off in Central Europe, in 1211, the Teutonic Order was invited into Hungary. But at the core of the Teutonic Order were the Knights of the Black Cross, a martial and entirely vampiric order under the command of Grand Master Jürgen von Werden and his lieutenant, Grand Commander Lucretia von Hartz, who were both offspring of Hardestat the Elder. They would use Hungary as a staging area to begin their campaign against the Tzimisce. In 1218, Pope Innocent III died and was succeeded by Honorius III. Honorius quietly financed an organization called the Shadow Inquisition. The Shadow Inquisition existed largely to gather intelligence, collect and assemble records based on the information leaked to the church by Fabrizio Ufila, and tortured from those vampires in southern France who had the misfortune to fall into the hands of the Crusaders. Just 1 year later, in 1219, the Order of the Poor Knights of the Passion of the Cross of Acre were charged by the Pope to protect pilgrims and also to hunt down demons, fiends, heretics, and witches. In 1231, Pope Gregory IX, successor to Honorius III, appointed a number of papal inquisitors from the Franciscan and Dominican orders to bring some measure of procedure and even-handedness to the episcopal inquisitions in France and Germany. One German Dominican, Leopold of Murnau, was granted special papal dispensation to hunt down and destroy such supernatural creatures as he could find, with special attention to be paid to the blood-sucking demons of the night, a task at which he was frighteningly successful, thanks to the information gathered by the previous Shadow Inquisition. Back in the Middle East, in 1291, after over a century of being hunted by the Tremere, the warrior and healer branches of the Salubri met at Acre to discuss the future of the clan. But in the end, they agreed upon no plan. The remaining warriors sailed north to combat the Tremere, while the remaining healers retreated from the world, and were slowly hunted into veritable extinction. Over a century later, in 1394, there was a meeting in Vienna of elder vampires to answer the question of the Inquisition and the newly formed Anarchs. This meeting was chaired by Hardestat the Elder of Clan Ventru and Mirlinda of House Tremere, now Clan Tremere. By now, the Tremere were, more or less, open allies of Hardestat and under his protection while in his domain. For the previous century, the Inquisition had been frighteningly effective at identifying and destroying vampires in Europe, especially those who existed in the open as such, whether as feudal lords, priests and icons of blood cults, or as monsters roaming the highways. The solution that the elder vampires had to the Inquisition problem was to simply throw their childer to the Inquisitors and make their own escape. An effective strategy, except some of these fledglings had the temerity to survive and band together for protection and revenge. These masterless, domainless anarchs began hunting their elders and committing the amaranth upon them, devouring the blood and souls of their betters. Lord Hardestat proposed that, to deal with the problem of the Inquisition, that the elders ruthlessly enforced the tradition of the Masquerade on pain of final death in all of their domains. Some, like Mithras of London, dismissed Hardestat out of hand, but quite a few more were receptive to his proposal. However, the next year, the Brujas rebel Tyler attacked and diablerized Hardestat the Elder in Spain. The murder was later covered up, and Hardestat the Younger, who greatly resembled his sire, assumed the role of Hardestat the Elder in the nascent Camarilla. A decade later, in 1405, the Anarchs achieved their greatest coup to date. Gratiano de Veronese joined the Anarch revolt and led a combined force of Anarchs and Assamite mercenaries in an attack on the Castel de Ombro in Sicily to slay his sire, the La Sombra Antediluvian. The attack succeeded, and the majority of the clan then joined the Anarch revolt. Those still loyal to the Antediluvian joined his eldest child, Montano, in hiding, and became known, mockingly, as Antitribu. 8 years later, in 1413, Tzimisce Anarchs, led by Lugaj, attacked the Tzimisce Antediluvians' haven at Chernog Monastery. To all observers, it appeared that the attack succeeded. However, a Tzimisce elder and turncoat named Lambach Ruthven saw that the antediluvian had disguised itself as Lugaj and left the true Anarch impaled on a wooden hook. The antediluvian, still disguised, promised to awaken on the eve of Gehenna before returning to torpor. Clan Tzimisce was then split between the Anarchs and the Voivodes. The Voivodes would not cede 1 inch of domain or rule to a group of insolent rabble. A handful of Voivodes united to form the Oradea League for mutual defense. In 1435, the founders of the Camarilla met again to empower 7 of their number to act as enforcers of the traditions, and especially the Masquerade. These were Adana de Sforza, a Promethean Bruja, Milov Petronenkov, a gangrel who was as persuasive as he was laconic, Camilla Baines, a Malkavian seer who could swing wildly between gentleness and brutal violence, Josef von Bauren, a German Nosferatu who weighed his words as carefully as if he paid for each one in gold, Rafael de Corazon, a Toreador and possibly the greatest poser the clan has ever sired, Mistress Fanchon of Clan Tremere, as equally skilled in manipulation as in thaumaturgy, and Hardestat the Elder, or younger, who should need no introduction. These founding 7, the first Justicars, successfully staunched the bleeding of the Anarch revolt. However, they would taste defeat just 9 years later, on April 12th, as Cappadocius was diablerized by his treacherous child, Augustus Giovanni. This deed earned the Giovanni the enmity of the Camarilla, but the founders were unwilling to wage war against Anarchs, Assamites, and Giovanni simultaneously. In 1450, the founders convened another meeting, again to formalize the Justicars' role as the public face of the Camarilla. They would serve as the representatives of their clan, as adjudicators, investigators, diplomats, and executioners as the situation might require. The rest of the founders would play a quieter role as the authority empowering the Justicars' actions, the inner circle. And below the Justicars, a constabulary was established to deal with lesser matters of interest that did not call for the full weight of a Justicar's attention. These were later known as Archons. The original 4 Archons raised to office were Gilbert de Harfleur of Clan Ventru, Jean-Marc de Harfleur of Clan Toreador, his cousin, Federico de Padua, the right hand of the Camarilla of Clan Nosferatu, and Lilica Kairos of Clan Bruja. In 1486, Etrius of Clan Tremere successfully persuaded the Justicars to call for a blood hunt against the entirety of Clan Assamite, the first and only time the Camarilla has condemned an entire clan. By 1492, the Camarilla has successfully routed the Anarchs throughout their domains and captured or slain many of them. The Camarilla invited all relevant vampires to attend a convocation at the Abbey of the Sacred Crown in Thorns. The safety of the attendees was vouched for by Father Samuel, the Toreador abbot and prince of Southampton, as well as Mithras, who had held himself apart from Camarilla and Anarch alike. The convocation was scheduled for the 3rd week of October in 1493. The Convention of Thorns began on October 18, 1493, with over 50 vampires in attendance, representing the Camarilla, the Anarchs, their respective clans, or just themselves. Eleanor de Valois of Clan Bruja opened the convention and addressed the subject matters at issue: reconciliation with some Anarchs, punishment for others, the blood hunt against the Assamites, and the continuation of the Camarilla. Micah Vikos of Clan Tzimisce verbally jousted with Lord Hardestat. Vikos argued for the freedom and independence of vampire over the rule of their elders. Hardestat replied that Vikos and his ilk had done nothing with their freedom but indulge in murder and mayhem, which was proof that the rule of age and generation was a sound principle. The Assamite Hussein Al-Fatin spoke for his clan. Mistress Fanchon rose in response to call for strong measures against the continued practice of diablerie, which only brought howls of scorn and snide remarks from the Anarchs with respect to the Tremere's sharp treatment of the Salubri, as well as the Camarilla's timidity towards the Giovanni usurpers of Clan Cappadocian. Then Tyler shoved her way out of the Anarch delegation and tried to assassinate Hardestat with a pair of pistols, but when the smoke cleared and Hardestat appeared mostly unwounded, Tyler fled the abbey. After 6 nights of discussion and debate, the treaty, the document known as the Convention of Thorns, was read to the assembled vampires. Many of the Anarchs submitted to the treaty, and their submission was reinforced by being bloodbound to the elders of the inner circle. But other Anarchs were conspicuously absent. The worst of the Anarchs knew that the elders intended to impose harsh penalties on them and saw no reason to submit to Camarilla justice. Instead, the Anarchs planned a grand spectacle to demonstrate the futility of the Camarilla and its so-called Masquerade, a veritable Sabbat of witches and devils. On October 24th, the night after the Convention of Thorns was read, rebellious Anarchs led by Micah Vikos descended on the town of Silchester, an hour's walk from the abbey. This Sabbat killed and terrorized mortals with wild abandon, but they were chased off or slain by the Archons and Justicars. Hardestat and Raphael de Corazon used their disciplines to alter the memories of the survivors. This event, later known as Halcedema, the Field of Blood, was the first major breach of the Masquerade and of its repair. But there were more Sabbats of devils and witches throughout Europe, composed mainly of La Sombra, Tzimisce, and anyone else who balked at the rule of the Camarilla. Through Valdery and Rite, these many Sabbats were later brought together as pacts under the authority of a single Grand Sabbat. The Camarilla, the self-proclaimed estate of Cain, keepers of Cain's law and bearers of his authority, would spend the next 5 centuries locked in battle with the Sabbat, the self-proclaimed Sword of Cain, the army of the Dark Father against the treacherous antediluvians and their Camarilla puppets. The blood hunt against the Assamites would conclude in 1495, when a Nosferatu scout discovered the location of Alamut, quite by accident. The eldest, ruler of the clan in Hakim's absence, surrendered to the Camarilla to save his clan so that they could take revenge later. The Treaty of Tyre, signed in 1496, demilitarized the fortress of Alamut, forbade the Assamites from leaving their traditional territory, from acting as hired assassins, and from committing diablerie on non-Assamites. This last provision was enforced by a curse cast on nearly the entire clan by the Tremere. The eldest later invited the challenge of Jamal, Caliph of the warrior caste, to pay for the shame of the clan's submission with his own unlife. Jamal diablerized the eldest and claimed leadership of the clan. But some Assamites' pride would not allow them to submit to this shameful peace. Izim Urbal led a contingent of warriors to join the Sabbat and form the core of its military arm, the Black Hand. Finally, the Giovanni. As with the Tremere, the inner circle was willing to forgive prior transgressions in the interest of stability. The promise of 1428 recognized the Giovanni as the lawful successors of the Cappadocians, the new Clan of Death, and held that Venice was their exclusive domain. In exchange, the Giovanni pledged to abide by the laws of the Camarilla and to not interfere in the sect's affairs, an arrangement which suited the necromancers admirably. As for the Ravnos and followers of Set, well, no one but a Malkavian would make an agreement with charlatans or snakes and expect them to honor it, so they were largely left out in the cold as the political landscape shifted into its new configuration. And that, dear listener, is pretty much where vampires stood in Europe as the War of Princes and the Anarch Revolt, well, the first Anarch Revolt, came to a close. We covered a lot of ground very quickly, like a 4-minute mile, and unfortunately some of the more obscure, or just plain strange, events of Vampire will have to be saved for other videos. But now, vampires have an entirely new playground opening up to cause mischief in, the Americas. So, next video will be the history of vampires, part 2, 16th century until November 1st, 2004. And there's an explosion at the end. Until next time.